Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 18 of the I Can Fly podcast. Today's episode is with Dan Gibson, the founder of the Columbus Classical Academy here in Columbus, Ohio. I first met Dan about a month ago through a mutual friend who we talk about on the show, and I was incredibly struck by his passionate journey that he's been on, going from a practicing lawyer here in town to starting a school here in Columbus, Ohio, where they had their first academic year last year. It's not just the fact of going about starting a school that intrigued me about him, though, but it was his intense passion about the education for our future generations, where it's been, more importantly, where it's going, and seeing him be somebody that's actually out in the world and doing something about it. This is definitely a very different conversation for us. This is our 18th episode, and definitely, in some capacity, our most polarizing one. However, with that said, I do want to make it clear that at I Can Fly, we're not here to express a political opinion or necessarily make this any kind of advertisement towards his school or what our general thought is. But our goal, as always, is to provide a forum for honest, direct, and forthright conversations where we can share opinions, even have differing ones, and ultimately share information that helps us all benefit and learn. So I'm excited to see what everybody takes from this. Frankly, I was very inspired by the work that Dan is doing with the Columbus Classical Academy. And if I were having children today, I would be hard-pressed to not look his direction to be raising those children in his schools. So I hope everyone enjoys this episode. I look forward to hearing the responses. And I think go into this with an open mind. This is arguably, as always, one of the most important topics for the future of our country and generations. Please enjoy this episode with Dan Gibson. Thank you.
Not on any social media.
Yeah.
I don't have any sort of awareness of that whole world.
Yeah.
Unless somebody sends something specific to me.
Yeah.
Right. So they'll say like, listen to this, but I don't have like a roster of podcasts I listen to, and I don't have Twitter accounts that I follow or things like that. So this is all I feel very old, but I never got onto Facebook when it started.
Yeah.
And so I've just never sort of entered into that entire world, basically.
In some ways, I envy it. I mean, I think, I was just talking to a friend yesterday. Actually, someone's been on the pod, Camilo Villegas. I was talking to him yesterday, and he said he's been completely off social media for like a month and a half, deleted all the apps on his phone.
Yeah.
And he's like, dude, it's unbelievable just to try to figure out, what do you do with all the kind of knee-jerk reactions that you have to grab your phone and you just swipe mindlessly, or he's like, you have this time back that you didn't really realize. And for him, he said what's interesting is at first, he's like, you think you're missing so much.
Yeah.
And then very quickly you realize you're really missing absolutely nothing important. And so, yeah, it plays a huge role. I certainly feel like I battle my own versions of addiction with social media. And obviously that's something that is, hitting our youth very hard too. So
it actually is even more, and I don't want to delay the start unless we're already going, but it's funny, everybody thinks everything is new, but Neil Postman wrote a book in the 80s called Amusing Ourselves to Death, and it was about the advent of television culture in America. And you go back to Marshall McLuhan, wrote a book in the 60s, Understanding Media, I think it was, and he's the one who coined the term, the medium is the message. And there's this entire this sense that like the social media is all new. Well, it is in the sense that it's a new medium, a new mechanism for transmitting. But we've battled these kind of, if you want to call it addictions or sort of new ways of digesting information for a long time. The advent of television news became this sort of world where you could be totally immersed in the news that's going on in Singapore or in the Ukraine or whatever, and it has no immediate bearing on your life today. And yet it's the thing that sort of gives you anxiety, and it's the thing that gives you expends your mental energy. And some have argued, and I think there's some compelling case of this, that we've lost the local neighborhood. We've lost the element of immediate community in exchange for the global news or the social media feed or the other things. And you can see it in a concrete way with people who are sort of walking around holding their phones constantly. But even as far back as television, and transmitting messages. I think postman even goes back to the transmission of the telegraph, when you didn't have to sort of write a letter and wait a week and a half for it to arrive. It really adjusted the way that people engaged with one another. And I don't know that I have a qualitative, like, good, bad sort of other than just we need to be more aware of the ways in which it changes the kind of approach that we take to other people and to the information we digest.
Yeah, and I think your point's interesting, though, which is over time, there's always been these different mediums, whatever it may be, that are growing or becoming more modernized, right? They're changing in different ways, but there's always been, to your point, this book that was written, when did you say that was?
In the 80s, I think.
Right, so, but it's probably incredibly applicable today.
Right.
And so I think it forms an interesting kind of starting point for our conversation today, which, first off, Dan, thank you very much for being here with us today. This is a really, I'm excited about this conversation in general because, frankly, it's very different than anyone we've had before on the show. This is really diving into a very specific subject matter around education and the lives of our children, probably both in this country and others as well. And then also, when we met through a very close mutual friend of mine, Trent Jones, who I've talked about a few times on the show and just think the world of. He's a great kid, one of my best friends I've known since middle school, and a pastor here at local Baptist church, Linworth.
My church.
Your church, yeah.
Yes.
Be there this Sunday because he's preaching this Sunday, which will be cool. But he introduced us because he heard one of your presentations recently and said, this is a really fascinating thing. He was really captivated by it. But not just the topics that you hit on, right? But that you are actually going out and doing something about it and starting the school here in Columbus. So, perhaps before we dive deep into that topic, which you will throughout the day, first, tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how we got here.
By the way, I'm probably your first guest who has only shot under 100 on the golf course one time in my life. So
Okay.
That's one thing you can know about me. I grew up in Worcester, which is sort of northeast Ohio, on the way to Cleveland a little bit. My dad's a clinical psychologist, and my mom's she was a stay-at-home mom and then got into education. She actually was the principal of a Christian school during a couple of years during my childhood. But I went to all public schools and then went off to college at Davidson, which most people know because of Steph Curry. He was a little bit after me, and then to law school at Stanford. And I practiced law in Columbus for 15, 16 years at Bricker, which is one of the bigger sort of local regional firms based in downtown Columbus. And then I have a wife and two daughters. We live in Worthington, and like a lot of people, sort of how did we get here? COVID was pretty disruptive to our lives, but I think for myself at least, in a very positive way. And I sort of gave you an opportunity to stop, slow down, reflect, look at some of the choices you were making about your life, look at, definitely got a lot more insight into education during remote learning, seeing what your kids are doing online. And so that's sort of what precipitated my sort of path into the educational world. But that sort of started the process, but it also was one of the things that led me to Trent's church. We had been attending another church and really good people, but I just became more cognizant of some things. I did a lot of reading during COVID of theology, history, philosophy, and a number of other things sort of converged, and through a lot of prayer and conversation with family and an opportunity that arose, I sort of made the transition to doing what I'm doing now, which is heading up a new school.
And I think, you touched on something that I'm certainly not there yet. I haven't started having children yet, and hopefully look forward to at some point. I feel like it's my greatest purpose for being on earth to be a father one day. And but I do have many peers and friends that are starting to either have children or are raising children and are at ages where they're starting to look at schools. And they're, I think, at a very similar, kind of challenging point that you, sounds like, found yourself in a little bit with your own children, where they're having a hard time finding a place that they feel good about sending their kids to. And so, maybe to dive specifically into that area, talk about a little bit generally the state of education in our country right now, maybe some facts and data points behind it, and how that's led to eventually the creation of the Columbus Classical Academy.
So I think the starting point on sort of the state of education is to first recognize a tendency in ourselves. And this was certainly the case during COVID, which is the temptation to look at sort of the headlines that you see in the schools today. There's a lot of gender stuff, racial stuff, political stuff, and to think, oh dear, something just happened and we got to get that stuff out of the schools. And that's the way we get back to sort of good schooling. And one of the things that I learned as I sort of dug in and was looking at other schooling options for my own kids was that there's a long history to sort of the transformation of schooling in America that goes back a whole lot longer than even back when I was in public schools. If we look at data points today, I mean, some things you look at like NAEP scores, National Association of Educational Progress, and you just see sort of basic proficiency numbers. There's not a single category in which American eighth graders, more than a third of them, are proficient in math or reading or civics or history. The ACT scores are on a 5-year decline. They're at their lowest point since, I think, 1991. But you also see other things like grades are getting higher. As you get, classes of valedictorians of, 30 kids, all with, perfect grades. So something funny is going on there. I don't think it's any secret that schools are also dealing with a whole bunch of mental health issues. They sort of doubled down on that with things like social and emotional learning, a lot of on-staff mental health experts, psychologists and psychiatrists. You're also seeing sort of some sort of cultural shifting, right, which is sort of a broader indicator, but you see sort of a shifting in, and I don't want to get sort of overly political, but a shifting in values of what people used to care about and sort of were foundational to their lives. Things like building a family, being involved in your community, some form of faith in God, and even sort of a general love of your country. So all these things are sort of happening at the same time, where you see a sort of decline in those values. And I kind of wonder, so what's going on? And if you read the literature sort of the history of education, it really just sort of tracks sort of the history of ideas in the West and sort of general sort of worldview. And, I don't know if that sort of answers your question, sort of the state of education, but what I found was sort of surprising is how uniform schools are today, even despite their differences. If you talk about elite college prep private schools, you talk about faith-based Catholic or evangelical schools, you talk about the public schools, they're really pretty dramatically similar in the way in which they approach education and what they perceive to be the goals of teaching a child. And so that's when I sort of really started to realize that what I was looking for wasn't a better school, it was a different way of doing it, and it turned out it was the old way of doing it.
Right.
And that's the path that Columbus Classical Academy is trying to sort of rechart. And we're not new, we're late to the party. I mean, there are homeschoolers that have been doing classical education for decades, and even some institutional schools that have been around for a long time. But that realization that there's a connection between that decline of knowledge. The other one I didn't mention was the increase in cheating.
Yeah.
And sort of young people's perspective on moral choices has pretty dramatically shifted into a sort of a relativism and a feelings-based decision-making process, where I judge the moral correctness of a decision based on whether it feels right. You can see that in our language even, right? When people articulate an opinion, they generally say, well, I feel that, and then they fill in the blank, right? And should be, well, I think that, or I believe that.
Sure.
And sort of that de-intellectualization and sort of emotive form of articulating ideas, all stems from a common history. But it's one that I didn't know about, and I had to sort of really learn about to understand why schools are what they are today.
Yeah, and to go backwards, I mean, the first thing that I was really triggered by in what you just said was, this dichotomy of general testing scores, right? ACTs being on a 5-year track of downward trajectory, right? While grades in schools are going up. And so maybe if you can hit on that more specifically, because to me that's a fascinating concept. Yeah. I don't really fully understand why that's happening. So if you can just touch on that a little bit more.
Yeah, and I'm not per se an expert on sort of grade inflation history, but I do know that it started out what I would call unintentionally.
Okay.
And you can imagine sort of a parent in school or a parent with a kid in school. They want to know their child's doing well. And if their child's doing poorly, then a teacher's going to, have some conversations. They're going to want to know why and whether there's teaching failures. What you end up with is sort of this built-in incentive to sort of tell kids that they're doing well because it reflects well on them. Parents are happy. They move on. Harvey Mansfield is a political philosophy professor at Harvard, and he started noticing it. This was in a weekend interview he gave at Wall Street Journal. He started noticing it at the collegiate level. He didn't really make anything of it at first, is what he says. He says, okay, so they're starting to just pump up the grades a little bit. What he observed, though, was that it produced a sort of shift in the mentality, not just of the faculty, but of the students. Obviously, with grade inflation, you have kids then who have less incentive to work hard, and they have less incentive to hold themselves to a homework deadline or do well on a test. But it also conveys this sort of philosophy of non-judgmentalism. And so sort of the hierarchy of standards in schools start to get eroded, not because they've actually said, this isn't the material you need to know, but you're going to get an A anyway. And even if it starts out with a sort of non-intentionality, it's just sort of by happenstance because the teacher feels better and the parents feel better and the kids feel better, everybody feels better if everyone's getting good grades. We've recently shifted into what folks have started to call equitable grading. And it has now become a part of a political project, right? And some of it stems from legitimate concerns, right? That if there is a mass sort of disparity in educational outcomes, that we should be looking and trying to figure out what's producing that. We shouldn't just regard it as, well, those kids are dumb and those kids are smart. But it solves the problem at the end point rather than the foundation point. Right? And it says, okay, well, then we'll just recalibrate all of the grading to make sure that we've wiped out that disparity. Instead of saying, but if you change the grades and these kids haven't learned anything more, how are we actually better off other than just feeling good? And so that's one of the sort of big indicators. The why in it, I genuinely think, is probably more than anything just a desire to affirm and tell people they're doing well, which I think comes from a good place. But it doesn't do them any good to tell them they're doing well when they actually haven't learned the material.
Right. And so within that specifically then, that data then also ties into the more personal and emotional side of a child, like you talked about, which ties into the rising of depression. Amongst children. It ties into even the rising amounts of suicidal thoughts or actually acting on that.
Yeah.
Is that true? Do you feel there's a correlation in those in some capacity?
I think they're somewhat connected. I don't know that there's a full-throated direct causal link, but Yeah,
maybe it's not actually the academic side of it that's connected to it, but it's the concept of pushing up, right? Getting rid of this meritocracy where you actually are earning a great grade in something, whereas everyone is being told at a more general level you're doing well.
Right.
If that's not true and you're actually not growing as a human or in a child in this case, that's where I'm saying is there more of a tie, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think there's also the flip side of that is the overvaluation of grades. So we've done two things at once. We've said that the grades matter so much to your human worth, And as a corollary to that said, well, then no one can fail or no one can do poorly because it's now labeling them with sort of a personal failure. Instead of letting a grade be what it is, which is a measure at a moment in time of what knowledge you have acquired in that subject matter. It doesn't make you a better human being or a worse human being, but within the context of schooling, the object here is to learn the material that you've been presented with and to become an educated person. And so your grade should reflect that, but it also shouldn't be the thing that dictates sort of your own self-worth. You see some of those suicidal tendencies and those mental health challenges in some of the most successful students, ironically. And I think a part of that is, the analogy I often use is the myth of Sisyphus. And it's the story of Sisyphus who gets punished by the gods, and he has to roll the giant rock up the hill for all of eternity. He rolls it to the top, and then it just rolls back down, and he has to do it over and over again. And Camus, the existentialist philosopher, said, well, I like to imagine Sisyphus happy, that this is just what life is. It's just rolling the giant rock up the hill. That answer is not satisfactory because a futile life aimed at nothing is not going to produce happiness. Yeah. But the answer of our modern education system has largely been, well, then let's just make the rock lighter, right? Make it easier and easier to roll it up the hill. But the real answer is we need to roll the rock somewhere. Students have to have a sense that they're pushing the rock up the hill not just to ding the A grade, but because they've gained some kind of insight or understanding as a result of mastering this material. Otherwise, it's just a task for the sake of an incentive, which is a number grade or a letter grade. And it doesn't produce what the real sort of essence of a classical education is it doesn't produce rightly ordered affections. Right? So it's not just that we want students to be knowledgeable and know things. We want them to love learning, to love pursuing what is true. I mean, this very podcast is an example of that, of what motivates you. We were talking earlier about learning from people and from their experiences and from ideas, because it's just good to know. And Aristotle, I think it said, knowledge or education begins with wonder. And so a lot of what we're trying to accomplish is a restoration of that sense of wonder in kids. You're not doing this to get the A. The A is a measure of your learning process over the course of the year. You're doing this because the world is wonderful and exciting and mystical in many ways. You should want to go and learn about it.
And where do you think the breakdown is in that now? Why? And I feel like, first off, in some ways, when I ask questions and talk about this today, I feel like I'm asking them from a pretty uneducated perspective. I don't have very much of a background in this space. Like I said, I don't have children yet. I graduated high school, almost 10 years ago.
Right.
And what's wild is, I feel like the general landscape of education as I read about it and hear about it today, in just those 10 years is dramatically different. I went to a charter private school here in Columbus, Ohio. It was a very small school. I graduated with 24 kids, so a very individualized education. But a great school. Sadly, one that didn't make it, actually went out of business just before COVID. I had a great experience there, though. A very personalized education, a very challenging school, I found. I mean, there were really challenging AP courses that we could take, and those were oftentimes some of the more satisfactory, to your point. But I just before we dive too much into why you've gone on this path of starting a school and what drove you down that lane, it's just fascinating to me how much things have changed in such a short amount of time.
Yeah.
And how much maybe that is political, like you said, versus, in some capacity, maybe the softening edge around feelings of children and wanting to kind of coddle, kids a little bit differently. I'm curious how that lands with you.
So my perspective on this is that if you look at the history of education, the real shift has been in what the goal of education is. And so it changes the way in which things get taught, and it changes what gets taught. And without going into sort of a extended history of education, more recently we've been through the progressive education era. What has happened in the last 10 years is a pretty rapid shift that has taken the sort of premises of progressive education to their more logical conclusions, which is the critical education movement and sort of the deconstructionist stuff, where you see much more of the sort of political activism and that sort of thing. But that the roots of that are in the progressive education model, and I'm using the word progressive sort of loosely, and it's sort of a term of art within the educational arena. That first you lose the sense of wonder in part because it was this perspective that the only real knowledge that you can have is scientific knowledge. Moral and historical knowledge really are just matters of perspective. And so there's a real emphasis, you saw it like a shift in the universities, right? You get humanities departments and the sciences, and they're very separate, right? The chemistry people don't talk to the Latin guys. That division has not always existed in schooling. But it comes from a perspective of the scientific revolution, the development of the industrial revolution, and the idea that really the sort of purpose of knowledge is usefulness. And so the reason you go to school is to develop a body of knowledge that's going to allow you to do something out in the world, some kind of a job, some kind of a function. In the early years, in the early 1900s, it's where you saw the advent of home economics, which a lot of girls were sent to so that they know how to do home tasks. It's where the advent of the shop class came in. And I'm not suggesting that these are sort of uniformly bad things, but they
That was
reflect.
my favorite, though. I had wood shop in school. Man, that was the best. Working on the lathe. I mean, it was, and I still have some of the pens we made.
And I think I still have a stool maybe that that we made back in shop class.
And I don't have a lot of the other assignments that I worked on in school, but I've still got those pens.
And it is a set of useful skills.
Yeah.
But practically speaking, very few people, just as the success of the movement, very few people came out of having had shop class and were like prepared to be a woodworker for life.
Yeah.
But it was this model, and it's also the reason you shifted out of history into social studies. Social studies is studying of social institutions. Kids are more likely to learn something like, how do you go and cast a ballot at your local precinct? Instead of learning, okay, the origins of our sort of democratic republic are Athenian democracy, representative government. What does that mean? What does it mean about what we believe about human beings and what good and right government should look like? And the reason is because you had a shift from teaching for wisdom and virtue for teaching for usefulness and productivity. And the usefulness and productivity of progressive education said, well, now learning all needs to have some kind of practical goal to it. And when you do that, you remove the sense of wonder because you're not learning for the sake of just understanding the natural world. You're learning because we have a problem we've got to solve, right? And you are going to become a contributor to the social order by helping to fix that problem. And if we educate you with the tools you need to fix the problems of society, then that's a successful education. And it's not that those things are unimportant, but classical education says those things are secondary. The first and primary purpose of an education is to develop and form a mature human being. And that human being then can learn, whether it's through apprenticeships or otherwise, to do the things that are necessary to earn a living. You go back to Lincoln, right? He didn't go to law school. He just learned to practice law in a legal office. You go back to most of the people throughout the course of history. They didn't, particularly in their K-12 education, weren't learning a particular skill set. They were learning sort of the grand and great history of their civilization so that they were a mature and virtuous individual, so that whatever they were called to do as an adult, they were equipped to do it in a manner that was, of high character, pursuit of excellence, and that's really what classical education seeks to instill, that base of knowledge and character formation that'll equip you for anything.
So, yeah, and that's a perfect place to take this to next. One of the questions I had for you, perhaps more generally, was, in your eyes, what do you see the purpose for education being? But second to that, maybe more specifically with what you were just talking about, talk about really what is classical education, and what has it been thought to be historically versus what it is today?
Yeah. Well, I'll take the second one first, and sort of what is classical education. Because the classical education movement has sort of emerged and sort of experiencing a renaissance, you can probably get as many answers as people you ask the question to. There's a lot of ways to slice it. At its core, it is the pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And it seeks to produce virtue. And that seems very high level. You say, well, what school would object to that? And so you have to sort of drill down and unpack it a little bit to get a better picture of why it's different. But some of it is what I was discussing before, which is it's not about what is useful knowledge. It's much more about ordering your affections and your mind toward true, good, and beautiful things. But the other thing, on a more concrete level, you can characterize it. It's old school. It's traditional. Some of the things you won't see in most classical schools are screens and electronics. You'll see a lot of books. There's a reverence for books and for the written word. Classical education, broadly, you would probably say, is drawn from the Western tradition. Right? It starts with the pre-Socratic philosophers, and it works its way through ancient Greece, Rome, the Judeo-Christian tradition, heavily predicated upon the written word, and the idea that sort of the highest form of thought is that which pursues the highest form of truth, right? And that the good life, right, is not the life that is necessarily the most pleasant, but it is the life lived according to virtue. And virtue not being our modern notions of virtue, which tend to be like sort of sexual prudishness, but virtue in the Greek sense, and the word is arete, which turns out to be the same word as excellence. Right? And so it's this vision of a life, and same word that Paul uses in his letter to the Philippians about sort of what a Christian should turn their mind toward, that which is excellent. That is sort of the philosophical foundation of a classical education. And so in practical terms, we're not particularly enamored with technological developments because we're considering things that are eternal, things that are a part of the nature of human beings in every generation. And so that's why you read a Shakespeare, or that's why you read a Homer. And beyond that, you'll have other features will be teacher-led classrooms. They may sound kind of strange, but the reality is modern education today is actually not very teacher-led. There's a phrase that a lot of folks like to use, teachers should be a guide on the side, not a sage on the stage. And it's a modern educational sort of view that says that the teacher's role is to sort of help the student along their own educational journey, but to not to tell them what they ought to know. And classical education says, well, no, there are things that a mature, virtuous adult ought to know, and in order to teach them that, they need a teacher who already knows it and is going to impart that knowledge to them. And there is virtue and conduct and character that is representative of a mature, individual. And we need a teacher who is going to model that and demonstrate that and teach that to students, not simply walk alongside them in their own sort of path of self-discovery.
How does the screening of a teacher in a classical education setting change or differ than that of one in I don't know if traditional school, because actually I feel like that's almost what we're describing in a classical education is traditional, but in what is more the modern school system that we see today, how does the screening of a teacher change or differ?
So it starts with you generally hire for character, right? Not for technical competencies. That doesn't mean that you're not looking for people who are capable. Teaching is an art. Right, and there are people who you recognize right away are enormously gifted in the front of a classroom, have tremendous rapport with students, right? And that's critically important because if a child is ever going to have a sense of wonder about sort of what's being taught in a classroom, a place where their mom and dad told them you have to go here every day of the school week for the next 13 years of your life, you're going to have a teacher who loves knowledge and loves to share it. But you also have to have a teacher who is going to model virtue, who's going to demonstrate joy in the face of difficulty, right? If you want a child to ultimately learn to look at a struggle in the face and say, I'm going to tackle this, and even with setbacks, I'm going to persevere, and even in my perseverance and in the pain that it comes, I'm going to know that this is a good thing, right? That mentality is not something that you can didactically pound into a child. It has to be modeled by someone who lives it in front of them, because Kids are watching those teachers as closely for their own personal behavior as much as they are for, what they said about, that passage in Hamlet.
Sure.
And
it's
so
interesting you mentioned that, because the reason I'm smiling is I can't help but think about Robin Williams' character in Dead Poets Society, who is this incredible teacher of virtue and value, and inspired children in a poetry class of all, right? This group of boys becoming men who at the beginning of the movie didn't have much thrill to be in this classroom for poetry, and by the end we're all singing sonnets together and talking about challenging things, and it's just an all-time movie. But what you just described reminded me of him in some capacity. It inspires the viewer in the movie in some way. It does, right?
One of the fascinating things, and it's a wonderful example, because I actually use it sometimes when I talk to parents, because he's a two-dimensional picture in the educational world, and I learned this over the course of sort of reading the history and studying classical education. And to be very clear at the outset, I'm not suggesting that the administration in Dead Poets Society is what we aspire to. But Robin Williams in that character, Professor Keating, is a picture of an enormously gifted teacher who loves knowledge and loves to share it with children. But he is also, interestingly, a picture of the emergence of progressive and romantic education. If you look at a couple of the examples, when he's standing at the glass sort of trophy case, and it's got all the pictures of the prior classes, and he says the carpe diem, famous carpe diem, boys, seize the day, make your lives extraordinary. What's interesting is, what is the reason that he gives for saying carpe diem? Do you remember what he says about the guys in the picture?
I can't, not off the top of my head.
He says, look at these boys. You know what they're doing now? They're fertilizing daffodils. His philosophy is one where there is no eternity, right? His philosophy is one where the natural world is all there is. So the reason to make your life extraordinary is because it's over. And when it's over, it's done. The other one is when he's doing the courtyard scene. And they got the boys walking. He just says, walk however you want. It's fine. Just go walk. And eventually the boys are kind of walking and they start marching together. And they march in unison, and they're marching, in unison in the same direction around the courtyard. And he says, there it is. See it? And one of the other teachers from the school hollers down, and he says, Mr. Keating, what are you doing? And he says, it's an exercise to demonstrate something. And the other professor says, well, to demonstrate what? And Keating says, the dangers of conformity. Well, there's two parts to that. One is, what's the danger? He's illustrating that we may have a tendency to conformity, but that attitude, that romantic and ultimately now postmodern attitude, is very much the conformity is an evil in and of itself. Classical education and the classical worldview, and obviously the Christian worldview, says, now don't be conformed to the world just because it's the way the world's doing it, but you do have to conform your life to something. And the message that Williams is teaching his classes, or Keating is teaching those students, is in some respect, conform only to yourself. And the classical education says, no, conform to what is objectively good. Just because you feel it doesn't make it right. And so there's this interesting dynamic of this wonderful teacher, but who also has an element of the emergence of progressive education that's borne out in Dead Poets Society, that is really the seeds of where education in America has come to today. And they show it in that movie as sort of the romantic, wonderful vision versus the stern, almost draconian administration who's sort of sticking to the old guns. But you can have Robin Williams with a classical philosophy. And so that's sort of what we aspire to, the lover of knowledge and the lover of teaching, but who still believes that conformity is only dangerous if you conform to the wrong things.
Man, that's wild. Just a wild concept in terms of how to marry those two sides together.
Yeah.
Because I think, discipline, like you said, and having that classical approach is so important in a child's life. Yet also having that emotional and almost loving side that his character does has such an important aspect too. And so to your point in hiring a teacher, hiring this leader in a child's life. When I say child, I mean children, right, in a classroom. It's of the utmost importance that that person has the character of both.
Right.
I can see why in so many ways that is your most important. I mean, it starts with you defining what your school stands for, but then beyond that, it's in deciding who are the leaders and individuals that are going to be actually preaching the way.
Yeah, and it's an important point. Most organizations will tell you this: the people are the single most important, part of our organization or asset to our business, or however you want to describe it. But if you actually look at the behaviors of schools today, they pour the overwhelming amount of their resources into infrastructure, into technology, even into athletics facilities. And yet the single most important element to a young person's sort of experience in their educational career, which is only 13 years, are the people who stand in front of the classroom.
Yeah.
And the ones who are demonstrating to them the love of knowledge and the virtue that are going to have the greater impact on them.
Mm.
Most people don't graduate and say, man, we had the best turf football field. I mean, you wouldn't believe how great it was for those 4 years when I played. But they'll remember a teacher for the rest of their life.
100%. I can personally attest to that in every capacity, both in college and elementary, middle school, high school. It's interesting, actually, as I think about it in my own personal life, and this may be my personality a little bit, I probably tend to think to those maybe free-thinking teachers that I had a little bit more for some reason. Like my favorite course when I was in university at Ohio State was actually a study of world cinema. And it was exclusive. I love movies, and I've always been passionate about the arts in some capacity. But he was a great teacher because he brought the classroom setting itself was one that was. It forced you to engage. He could call on you at any time because it was a conversation.
Yep.
He had a flow to it, similar to this, our podcast in a way, but he had a flow, he had a mission for how the class was gonna go, but it was very much taught in a conversational setting. And obviously this is at a higher educational point. We're not, this was in college, this wasn't teaching third graders or something. Right. But these people played huge roles in your life that you look up to. And so, perhaps to kind of circle around this point, why in your eyes, besides the obvious points, why is this so important? How do you look at the data of what's going on generally, perhaps also anecdotally, the conversations that I alluded to earlier amongst friends and obviously on the news that we hear about the challenges in choosing a school. Why is this hit home for you as something so important that you would shift your entire career focus into dedicating yourself towards this? Yeah,
well, not surprisingly, I think I mentioned, and you were talking about becoming a father someday. I mean, the paternal sort of sense of duty and just care for your own children is an enormously motivating thing in life.
Sure.
So that's a big part of it. And it wasn't that my daughters were in awful places. They weren't. But it was the realization that there might be something dramatically better, but that it wasn't on offer here in Columbus. And so that was what motivated it.
All right, so getting back started, we paused there for a minute. We had a landscaping crew show up mid-interview there, which was good, but it gave us a second to pause and jump back in now. And so, we were just having this great, dialogue back and forth about Professor Keating, and Dead Poets Society, and beyond that, the methods of classical education, many of which hit home for me, and why we're having this conversation is because I relate to these being of the utmost importance going forward. But what I also think is interesting and that we need to always give room for is, I imagine there's downsides to this side of education as well, or maybe if it's not downsides, it's concerns. And so I'm curious, as you have gone down this path, what are the downsides that you've seen, or what are the concerns that you've seen come up the most in conversation?
Yeah, the question I probably get most frequently is this really for every kid, or do you have to sort of be an elite intellectual to benefit from this form of education? And I'd say emphatically that it is for every child, in part because classical education is predicated upon a correct understanding of learning and of human nature. it is harder. It's harder for the teacher, and it tends to be harder for the students in the sense that it is more rigorous. And so what a parent in particular has to come to sort of the educational choice with a frame of mind is that the stuff we talked about in terms of grades is not the thing. What you're pursuing is knowledge and virtue. And even if that doesn't necessarily produce a bunch of A's, that you will be producing and forming a mature adult who is still better off having gone through this form of education that is more rigorous, that is more challenging, that is more directed toward the higher forms of knowledge. If a parent, and thereby conveying it to their own child, helps to reinforce that that is why you're here at school, then there will be success for every child. C.S. Lewis has a really great essay, Democratic Education, and he cites Aristotle, who said, the truly democratic education is not the education that is appealing to democratic sensibilities. It's the education that helps sustain democracy. And paradoxically, that form of education is very hierarchical. It insists on teaching the best. It doesn't water down, it doesn't soften simply because that's sort of what would be appealing to the masses. But he uses the example of the boy who was whittling a little wooden ship under his desk during Latin class. And he says what modern education has done, and this is in the 1940s, he said, well, let's just send him out of Latin class and send him to shop class because he enjoys that more. Mm-hmm. But that's a mistake. He needs to learn the Latin just as much as the other kid, even if he's only going to get a C- in it, for two reasons. One is he simply needs to be there at the same time that his fellow classmate needs to be out on the playground when he gets dominated on the basketball court or whatever it is. But it's also because if you think of those two students not in terms of where they are right then, but when they're 25-year-old adults sort of entering into the world, is it better that the child who really struggled with the Latin but still got a 72 had learned 72% of the Latin language relatively effectively? Or is it better that nobody learned Latin because it produced too big of a disparity between those two students, the one who got the 95 and the one who got the 72? Mm. And so when parents ask the question, well, is this really for every child? My answer is going to be yes, it's for every child, but you also have to be willing to accept the fact that the grade is not the objective. The knowledge and the virtue are the objective, and every student will come out better off for it. Other kids who are extremely intellectually gifted may struggle more with the character development, the virtue, not being prideful, right? That's also an element of classical education. And so where those challenges come is going to be different for every child, but the form of education is good for all of them.
Yeah, in some ways, though, I can see that could present a challenge from the relationship side with the parents, right? I can see actually now maybe the root of a lot of this challenge hasn't been with the children wanting to have all better grades. It's that parents all want to hear that their kids are doing better.
Right.
So how does that, how do you, I guess it takes a unique parent, and what we're hearing, though, in society, whether it's on the news or amongst friends, like we were saying earlier, I think is that there is a desire to have that firmer education that is more meritocracy based. But how do you handle those conversations with parents where it's, a child is struggling in something, and that's maybe, I don't know if their answer is that it's okay, but that's a part of it.
Yeah, well, it can be a difficult conversation, but you also have to remember that struggling is not inherently good either. It's just that we've swung so far on the pendulum that struggling is inherently bad that we have to avoid it at all costs, is sort of the mentality today. Struggle will come naturally if you're learning anything of substance because you don't already know it and you have to work. If a child is struggling so much that there's something wrong, then that needs to be addressed. And it can be that the teacher is teaching ineffectively. It can also be that the student is not applying themselves. So you have to dig in, and that's why classical education depends very heavily on a close partnership with parents. And that's a big part of the reason why in the admissions process we screen for mission fit. We have to have parents who actually want this for their children, not who are just trying to escape some bad situation somewhere else. But Sometimes, and I would say frequently, we actually get very positive feedback from parents. I can give an example. Early on in the school year, we had a young student who the parents knew he was a little bit of a behavioral challenge. And he would routinely get 3 and 5 minute sit-outs at recess time. And they actually wrote an email to their teacher thanking her for the regular and consistent discipline that he was receiving, and that they were observing changes at home as a result of him receiving constant reinforcement of behavioral expectations. He still struggled with it. That was okay. He got a penalty for it. It wasn't a penalty that was unkind or cruel or excessive, but it was a punishment that produced in him a form of discipline. And it actually ultimately helped to change the child for the better. So as long as the parents come into it both from an academic standpoint and from a sort of character and virtue and behavior standpoint, recognizing this is a long game. We're not in the business here of making people feel good today. We're in the business of helping to form good, mature adults, and that takes time. And the parents, as much as the students, are going to need to be willing to persevere through some of that. I don't think it's any secret that every kid gets a trophy movement didn't get started by the kids, right? It got started by the parents. And so it does need to start there.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to my belief. I mean, education is the bedrock of our society moving forward or backwards, right? It starts in the classroom. It starts with educating our children, both with subject matter, but also with discipline. And I think that is a word that has gotten a bit pushed to the side to this point. We've allowed children to have stronger feelings than ever before, and almost be able to dictate, their lives at such young ages. And even I think I've lived that in some capacity in my own life, and looking back on it, you're too young to know right from wrong in so many ways. And so to have a definition of what right and wrong is set in place, a set of values, a set of truths, right? This should be dictated in schools, in my eyes. You can't allow children. I guess this is an interesting point. This is what's coming up for me as we're talking about it. How do you walk the line of teaching in morals, truths in society, yet also allowing for a child to have free thinking and have creativity? How do you walk that line?
Well, the line is a division in part between behavior and thought, right? Which is, you can entertain the idea, as Dostoevsky does in Crime and Punishment, right? Of what would it be like to embrace a sort of a Nietzschean overman philosophy and just go kill somebody because you wanted their money and see what happens. That's an exercise in sort of deep thought of entertaining an idea, but there's also the doing of the deed. And what children need is, first and foremost, at the youngest ages, as you pointed out, a clear sense of right and wrong, a clear sense of expectations, and the help conforming their lives to that. And also then the learning and the knowledge that's necessary to be able to engage in those deeper, thought processes. It's when they get to the higher grades and the more developed thinking, if they've gone through a rigorous form of education, that they can then grapple with those ideas. One of the things that's interesting is that there have been some studies of classical school associations that have been around a little bit longer, and what are some of the measures of their graduates. And one of the fascinating things about classically educated students, even though many people would say, well, they come from sort of a very conservative, traditional, strict kind of environment, it turns out that they actually score much higher on the independent thinking scale. And part of the reason for that is that after they have been equipped with the knowledge and sort of the base of information and exposure to the literature at the younger ages, to sort of see big ideas emerging, when they get into the high school level, they're actually engaging with some of those highly controversial thinkers. People like Rousseau, people like Friedrich Nietzsche, people like Sigmund Freud, people like that, and able to engage with those ideas at a level of sophistication that is at least going to be enriching for them, Or they can discern, well, I don't agree with that, or I do agree with that. We've gotten it kind of upside down in education now. And this comes from a Rousseauian view of children and of the purpose of education. And his view is kids are just naturally good. All the purpose of education really is to protect them from the bad influences of society so they can emerge into what they will naturally be. Anybody who's had kids, I know you haven't, but knows that they are not naturally good. Every child knows how to assault somebody without ever having learned it, knows how to lie without ever having learned it, and they also know how to steal without ever having learned it. The founders of the American Republic understood this, right? They set up a system of checks and balances predicated on the entire sort of view that men are not angels. But what does that mean for education then? It means that the youngest students shouldn't just be left to find their way. They need to be shown the way, right? And when they become mature adults, they have the ability to think freely and entertain big ideas and formulate opinions, but they have done so in a way in which the objective standards of right and wrong, which there are, and we insist upon, are adhered to, and they've become accustomed to conforming their life to those things. It does no one any good today in a political debate, right, to shout louder, right? What you need is someone who is more informed. What you need is someone who understands the point of disagreement and to be able to, in a civil manner, have that disagreement with someone without it turning into a fight. And what we see today is that we're not for any lack of strong opinions. What we lack are people who can thoughtfully deliberate on them and express their ideas in a respectful way. And it's the latter that we're trying to produce. We're not looking to have partisans of any stripe come out of our school. What we're looking to have are people who can formulate their ideas not as a little kid who knows nothing, but now as a fully formed adult who knows a great deal and can have an informed opinion and express it in a virtuous way.
That's interesting. I mean, I just this week was with a young man, great kid, 16 years old, and we were playing we were playing golf together, and we were having a debate about who the best James Bond was over time, right? And actually, contrarily to what you'd think, his argument was between Roger Moore. Was actually Roger Moore.
Oh, really?
Who I loved. I grew up, watching Roger Moore, but he was between Sean Connery and Roger Moore. I threw up an argument for Daniel Craig,
right?
Because I love him, and he's very much been the modern Bond of my time. But I've seen them all, and subjectively, Daniel Craig's my favorite James Bond. And he just put up the strongest argument against me as to why he isn't. And I'm like, well, what was your challenge? Well, I haven't even seen him. He said he hadn't even seen him. I said, listen, I have no problem with you having a debate with me and choosing that you think Sean Connery's your favorite, but if you haven't even seen him,
right.
You can't have an argument with something that you haven't personally experienced, right? And it was kind of a learning lesson in this case with him, and because I said, listen, I love that you're standing up for what you believe in, and this is a fun subjective debate,
right?
But you can't take a stance on something that you haven't experienced, right? He hadn't even seen the movies yet. So anyway, just that hit me as we were talking about, how you formulate a good debate and an honorable one as well. It's good that we have strong opinions, but how do we actually have a constructive debate
right.
where we can meet each other in that place?
And in fact, that is the sort of overarching tradition of Western civilization in what a lot of the folks in the classical world call the great conversation. Right? I mean, you go through the list of philosophers and you have the list of novelists and of all the great classics, and they describe it as a great conversation. I fear that if we started that process today, it would be called the great shouting match, right? And all of these thinkers have ideas and thoughts, some of which I have very visceral reactions to and think are completely wrong, but they've made significant contributions. And it is important for people to be exposed to them and to engage with them, but to engage with them at a head level, not a feelings level, right? And to evaluate it with some kind of background of knowledge. Katie O'Toole, who is the provost of K-12 education for Hillsdale College, and I don't know if I mentioned early in the process, one of the things that our school has the great blessing of having is the Hillsdale curriculum. Hillsdale, I think, is a wonderful institution, and they have, over more than a decade, curated what I think is the best K-12 curriculum in America. And that's the curriculum we utilize. They've given us the right to do so. And she has this great line, something I think to the effect of, students in Hillsdale K-12 schools have to earn the right to have an opinion. And they earn that right by being knowledgeable and having the capacity to express it in a virtuous way. We don't want to know what you think about something when you don't have any knowledge upon which to formulate that, like the Daniel Craig criticism, or if you don't have the capacity to articulate it in a way that would contribute to the great conversation as opposed to the great shouting match.
I love that.
And so that's what we're ultimately trying to produce. And that's why knowledge matters so much. If you only learn technique, right, then what are you drawing on to formulate views? What are you drawing on even just for this podcast is a great example. It edifies a lot of people, but it's also just a fun human engagement. Mm-hmm. It's what Alan Bloom talked about in The Closing of the American Mind, of the one thing that is sort of throughout all of human history is great conversation about big and important things, man to man. And you can't really do that if you don't know anything.
Well said. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, man, I could take that a lot of places because we've had a lot of interesting conversations. But, man, I think maybe to jump topics a little bit, but I was really illuminated by this when we first met. Walk me through what a day at Columbus Classical Academy looks like.
Yeah.
Because when I heard it struck me as different than what I know schools to be like today, yet also in a beautiful way reminded me a lot of my early education as well.
Yeah.
So,
and I suspect you're referring to Trent's sort of description of when he came and visited.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we start each morning. The kids arrive in the car line, and I and our principal and some of the other staff will greet them in the car line, open the doors for them, and they'll come out and then head up to the building and head in. And we do that in partly just because it's a nice thing to do. It's just an expression of kindness and a welcoming gesture to the students as they start their day. It's also, I know it gets overplayed a little bit, but it's a demonstration, a little bit of servant leadership. And the idea that we're here for you, even though we're in charge. And then we head in and we have an opening assembly every morning with the entire school. And that's relatively easy right now because we're a fairly small school. But we start each day with the Regent's Prayer, which is used to be the prayer actually of the New York public schools until it was declared unconstitutional for there to be any prayer in schools in the public dimension.
When was that, by the way?
I think it was like 62, 63,
okay.
Around then. And then after the prayer...
That long ago? I would have assumed that happened more recently, but...
Well, and there's always...
that is recent in this grand scheme of history, but...
There are also frequently cases that are sort of testing the limits now of what the court will view as permissible sort of religious exercise within a public school arena. So, but it's been going on for a while. The next part of our day, or the next part of the assembly then, is to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Then we sing a patriotic song, something like America Beautiful. And then they recite the honor code. And the reason for that is on a daily basis is to remind them Columbus Classical Academy student is honest in all things, upright in conduct, diligent in study, dutiful in service, and joyful in the face of difficulty. And I know that a lot of times they'll recite it without thinking about it, but it's one of those things that will linger in their mind long after they've graduated, and they'll think about it at some point. And then following the statement of the honor code, we have 2 to 3 students, depending on the number that the teachers have signed up, will come and do a recitation from memory of a piece of classic poetry, or in some instances something like the preamble to the Constitution or the Gettysburg Address, one of the things that they're working on memorizing in class. So they'll start out doing it in class over the course of a month, and then when the student is ready, the teacher will sign them up. And it'll be anything from a Robert Louis Stevenson poem to whatever it is that they happen to work on. Typically, it is integrated with their integrated with the subject that they're learning or the time period that they're learning in class at that stage.
Yeah, and it's almost interesting too because it gives the opportunity to almost enter into some public speaking as well.
Absolutely.
Right? Just for scale too, so our listeners understand, how many kids are in the school at this point?
We opened, last year was our first year,
Right.
and we had about 60 students. And this coming year, we're still, accepting applications, interviewing families and things. So we could end up anywhere, I think, from probably 85 to 100
Got it.
Students in year two. Hoping to just continue that growth trajectory. But
Yeah. And at what range of ages?
we started kindergarten through 8th grade.
Yeah.
And so we will be through 9th grade next year, so that class will always add a grade until they graduate, and then we'll be a full K-12 campus. And one of the things about classical education too is the idea that the K-12 community is a whole school. Modern schooling, again, has sort of broken us up into stages, and you get sent off to a new school where you consolidate all the elementary schools in the middle school, and then the middle schools all go to one high school. But a big part of, we think, the younger children's development is seeing what it is like to advance to the next stage. So being around those other students and even being mentored by them. We have mentor lunches where the 8th graders have sat down with the kindergartners and 1st graders so that they can ask questions about what it's like to be in the upper school and to help them open their thermos.
Yeah, right.
So, right. And it's a good service opportunity for the older kids.
Yeah. I can relate to that actually a little bit. The school I went to, given the scale that it was, we were all in one building, and the building was somewhat bifurcated, at least from lower school, middle school, and high school shared a lot of the same hallways and areas.
Yep.
But you had those rooms that you knew were, you were going to be at one day, and you always looked up
big
to.
kid room.
And you had the interactions with them too, right? You had the sporting events you could go to. You saw each other in the hallways, and that was an inspirational thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that just looking back on that in my own life, that was something as a child that, I was in the room and seeing these kids that were older than me. And, in this case, like I said, it was a very good school. I mean, there was a lot of reasons why you'd look up to a lot of the kids that were older too.
Right.
But it sounds like in this setting, you even formalize those interactions as well, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, at some level. We even like to have the upper school teachers come down, and they'll read to the lower elementary students or the lower school students, because we want the teachers to know the kids that they will eventually be teaching, 3, 4, 5, 6 years in the future, and to build relationships with them. And they'll even have some recess duties. Yeah. So in some ways, it's sort of more organic and sort of less structured, in the sense that there's a lot more, interaction across the entire community of the school. But in a lot of other ways, classical education is much more structured in the way that the academic and the daily life of the school is ordered.
Yeah, and so coming back to that, you have, kind of the opening, I was going to call it the opening ceremony of the day. And in some ways, there's ceremonial aspects to it, and
right.
that you have your Pledge of Allegiance, and then I love the aspect of, children reciting some, moral or some poem of sorts. Trent, I know, was just totally taken back by this, 3rd or 4th grade kid that just stood up and from memory recited this beautiful poem.
Yeah.
And so walk me through, how a day looks after that.
Yeah. And just a quick comment on that, the memorization of the poetry and the recitation of it, you talked about public speaking.
Yeah.
So one of the really important things, and even the final stage of classical education, is called the rhetoric stage. One of the things that the ancient Romans valued very highly was the skill of the rhetorician. It was the ability to articulate your ideas well and to be able to present to the public. And so these kids are getting this opportunity at a very early age to sort of either overcome that fear or to hone that skill of standing in front of their peers and delivering something that they wouldn't otherwise do on a regular basis. And the idea is, as a mature adult, that's going to, serve them well in whatever, context it ultimately manifests itself. After the end of the morning assembly, the school day doesn't look all that dissimilar to what a normal school day, if you sort of think in the upper school, you have periods and they shift from class to class based on the subject matter. And in the lower school, kindergarten through 5th grade, they have a contained classroom. One of the things that is different is curricularly what you might call the specials, or the gym, the arts, music, are not called specials in the classical world. They are co-curriculars. They are graded courses that are integrated into the curriculum on a historic register, so that you're studying the music from the time period of history that you're studying. You're studying art from the time period. And so, and PE is a huge component of classical education. PE is every day for kindergarten through 5th grade instead of just a couple of days a week. That's a recognition from as far back as the ancient Greek understanding of education, where young men were educated in the gymnasium, right? That the physical aspect to an education is a very important component to it, even if you're not an athlete. And so at the younger grades, they will do PE either in the morning or the afternoon. And if whichever end it is, then they also have a recess, so that there's a lot of physical activity as well as the lunch recess. So they're going to have 3 periods of real physical activity. And then in the upper school, they just have the lunch and then the formal PE course. The rest of the day is sort of depends on the class. At the youngest grades, the huge emphasis in classical education is on literacy and numeracy. Everybody kind of knows what literacy is, though classical education teaches it through an explicit phonics approach. Schools have gotten away from that. They moved into things like whole language, where you kind of memorize words by sight instead of assembling them by the sounds made in the English language. We've returned to a very, classical education has always stuck with a very phonics-based, because letters are codes for sounds, and that's how you read the English language. But numeracy is number sense, and that's emphasized at the lowest grades because it's the foundation for all mathematical learning. You can get good at formulaic sort of functions without ever really understanding what's happening in the mathematics. And so in those younger grades, their day is broken up into very small chunks of time, but lots of repeated visitations of those subjects. So you'll have a 7 or 9 minute phonics section in kindergarten, but then they'll move on to something else, like a story or some time on the rug, and then they'll return to phonics, and then they'll do some math, so that they're up and down a lot, because you have to recognize they're 5-year-old kids.
Right.
So that's sort of at the lower grade how it would function.
And how does technology play a role into this?
Yeah.
Because I imagine, at least all you have to do is go to a restaurant today and see that every child has an iPad in front of them at the age of 3. But I'm assuming in this case that technology isn't much of a part of the day within the school there. But talk a little bit about technology.
Yeah, so our teachers have a laptop, and they can project off of it for visual aid if they need to. But there's no one-to-one technology anywhere in the entire school. We have no permission for use of cell phones or even watches that can communicate. Those have to be turned off and put away, or they're taken away, partly because they're just a distraction to learning, but also I think you've probably seen a lot of the research that's showing that kids really need some time away from those things in order to develop in a healthy manner. But inside the classroom, there is a huge emphasis, particularly at the lower grades, on learning to write properly. And even at 2nd or 3rd grade, they start learning cursive, which is becoming a bit of a lost art because of the technological advancements. We're not Luddites. We don't think that technology is a bad thing, but it is a recognition that it has certain values built into it, namely efficiency, and that the primary sort of good in education is not necessarily pure efficiency. It's not how much information you can transmit in a speedy manner, which is what technology tends to do, and it's not amusement, which is what technology tends to do. It's deep and rich and rigorous thought. And so what we're working on developing in the classroom are the habits of mind that are used to engaging the written word, that are used to formulating your own thoughts in written sentences and paragraphs. And so we just don't utilize technology until they get into high school and they can use the computer lab for research papers and that sort of thing.
And our kids in your school, are they using technology actively outside the school typically, or are you finding that because you're not using them as much in school that they're not as apt to use them outside of the classroom?
No, they're modern kids.
Yeah.
Both of my girls, have screen time at home. We limit it, but it's not this province of sort of, not to belittle, but sort of an Amish way of life.
Yep.
Inside of a classroom. What it is it's a utilization of the tried and true methods that have actually developed young minds effectively for centuries. And the idea that the new shiny thing is not necessarily better, right? And they'll utilize it. That my girls have greater facility with, touch screens than I do. They're not going to have any, problem learning how to utilize those things and utilize them effectively because they exist in the world. But from an educational standpoint, what we're trying to achieve, that capacity for deep thought, a broad base of knowledge, that is not actually something that technology is well suited to provide. Yeah,
and part of the reason why this struck such a chord with me is, kind of like I shared with you in our lunch, especially since getting to know Morgan, I've become a lot more passionate about holistic health.
Yeah.
I've started to pay a lot more attention to what I eat, the actual ingredients behind it. I'm reading the labels on boxes. I know what to look for, what not to look for. And that's something that I think younger generations, and even beyond that generally, people are becoming more and more passionate about. There's access to the information as to why, we've got folks like Andrew Huberman and these different podcasts that are exposing true direct-to-source facts, that we can start to understand, not just believe, what the box says or what the commercial says about how great this thing is for you, but we can really understand the source. But I believe because of that, there is this reversion to a more holistic, or in this case, classical way of acting or thinking. And I knew it in the health aspect, right? When we've got Morgan, who all of our listeners obviously know and we share the pod with, and he's gone down a completely holistic path in healing, in his healing journey. But to me, this has very much a correlation. The classical education and a holistic health, these two have a very correlated relationship with one another because they're kind of reversion to history and doing things in a classical manner that had worked for centuries prior. To your point about the shiny object, you don't always have to do things in this new way. There's obviously been ways of healing or ways of teaching that have very successfully worked before.
Yeah, and I think I shared with you the video of one of our parents who sort of analogized what we're doing to the food world. And it is actually, I think, a very useful analogy because it takes these sort of values of efficiency and sort of being able to preserve the food for a long time, none of which are bad things in and of themselves, but they're not necessarily the best things for the food that we consume. And yet, it is no secret that Americans, myself included, eat enormous quantities of processed food with all kinds of additives and other things. Well, our schools are actually in some ways very similar. Because over time, we've developed the capacity to utilize these new techniques to do certain things. And we've seen certain kinds of results from them, but they're not necessarily human results. The results of how we can better package the food, right? Just like a textbook company says how we can now provide textbooks to students is on an iPad, and now we can provide updates in real time instead of having to run through another publishing run every 2 years. Well, that's not a bad thing in and of itself, but the question is, does it serve the purpose of education well? Just like does the ability to package food and let it be preserved for a decade before it spoils. It's not a bad thing in and of itself, but does it serve the purpose of actually consuming food, which is healthy growth and strengthening of the body? I think schools are in that same condition right now. It's that, and this stems from the philosophical discussion that I mentioned earlier, of this belief in the capacity for science, and particularly modern science, to subdue the natural world in a way that will always yield better results for humanity. And that's not necessarily true. It's not true in all arenas. Sure, I love the fact that I can drive a car. I love the fact that we have computers, the capacity to communicate with one another in unique ways. But it doesn't mean that those advances apply in every facet of life and that we ought to utilize them to their maximum. You're hearing a lot of this probably in the AI arena, right, and artificial intelligence. And sure, you have the folks who are screaming, this is terrifying, it's going to be the end of the world. And you have other people who say, just utilize it and see what happens. And we're taking, a different approach to technology generally, which is to say our goal is to equip these children to actually engage with whatever new technological advancement comes, but from a perspective of knowledge, both historical and scientific, and with a measure of virtue, which includes one of the 7 classical virtues is prudence. Should we use this technology? And if so, how should we use it? And what end is it serving? And that circles entirely back to the classical mode of thinking, which is the way you measure arete is whether something is serving its highest function. What is excellence? It is being that thing which it is designed to be. We can use technology in any number of sort of manners. The question is our use of the technology making us more fully what we ought to be, or is it really more using us?
Well, there's no question it's using us.
Right.
I mean, it's actually last night I was rewatching a documentary a few years back, The Social Dilemma.
Yes.
Which is a classic and should be watched by all. And one of the classic lines in that documentary is if you're not paying for something, you are the product, right?
And those are the developers of the technology speaking very candidly about it. But I don't want to say that if you like your iPad, then you can't have your kids be classically educated.
Sure,
that's certainly not the case. But it's an awareness, and it's awareness of what technology really is for.
So, I guess putting my future parenting shoes on in some capacity, or imagining what that would be like in choosing a school, or in starting to look at the different options that one has in doing so, whether it's homeschooling or some people for economic reasons may not have choices simply, but what are the questions that a parent should be asking in making that decision? What are the things that someone should be curious about? What are the things they should be looking for in a school?
Right.
How does that land with you?
Well, just because I had to go through the process myself, not coming to this from sort of a profession of education, the first question I would encourage them to ask, and to ask directly to the school, is, what is your goal in educating my child? A lot of people don't ask that question, and frankly, I suspect a lot of schools don't have sort of prepackaged answers to that because they're not asked very often. It's often a competition for, let us sort of share what we do well, but ask the why. Why are you in the business of educating kids, and what do you hope for? The other is, I always say, ask to see the curriculum. One of the things you see in modern schools today is that a lot of times there isn't an answer to that because they don't have a curriculum. It's very fragmented, and teachers themselves are responsible for coming up with what to teach in order to make it meet the state standards. One of the great benefits that we have of the license from Hillsdale College is that it's a curriculum. It's a 700-page curriculum guide, which goes through subject by subject, grade by grade, year by year, and even down to the month, of how the sequencing of those bodies of knowledge ought to be taught to the various grades. And so if a parent asks us, can I see the curriculum, right? We hand it to them, right? Or we direct them to the website where it's posted. And that will tell you a lot about what a school values. Are they only reading books that have been written in the last 5 years? Or are they reading books that were written 500 years ago? How much, I would ask the question about technology. I would ask whether or not you introduce technology to students, particularly as their one-to-one technology use. I don't think it's a bad thing to have a computer lab, but how much do you rely on it for your day-to-day sort of instruction. And I would also ask them, how do you hire your teachers? You asked the question earlier on, how do we screen for who are going to be the teachers in our school? And I think hearing what the criteria is, one of the great sort of advantages that we have of not being a state chartered private school and thereby not taking any state money is that our teachers do not have to be licensed by the state. Now, some people might say, oh dear, it's almost like having an unlicensed physician. But I would put our faculty up against anybody. And these are people with a lot of advanced degrees. Our history teacher has a doctorate. We have 7 or 8 master's degrees in subject matter. But if you ask most schools where they start in the hiring process, they first have to check the box of the credential, which is the teacher licensure. Ask them how they screen for their candidates, because who they're putting in front of the classroom is going to be the single most consequential thing, along with the curriculum that is taught, as to the child's education. So those would be 4 big ones that I would certainly ask on the front end.
Yeah, and I guess to keep my parenting shoes on, if I were interviewing you at your school, what is your goal in educating my child?
Right. So our goal is to produce a mature, virtuous citizen, and that entails a lot. Like I said, I mean, you use a term virtuous, you say, well, what does that really mean? But it is someone who is going to be robustly knowledgeable. Somebody used the phrase, I think it was somebody associated with the Hillsdale K-12 initiative, used the phrase that it is a terminal education. The goal of the education is such that if you never went to formal schooling again, you would be an educated American. And that is our goal. The goal is to make it so that these students are knowledgeable, not just about their nation's history, but about the history of the world, about the natural world and science, about mathematics, but also have character, and exhibit the 7 classical virtues that we sort of frame the school day around. And so my goal in educating a student is to have a knowledgeable and virtuous adult graduate from Columbus Classical Academy.
I love that. And it's concise, and in my eyes, it almost, the differentiation that comes up for me is this concept of raising or teaching to almost follow the masses, right? To kind of get along with everybody or have this equality sense versus raising critical thinkers who are also open-minded in that capacity as well. You brought up, and this probably, we could spend a whole podcast talking about just this in itself, but you brought it up a few times, so I want to hit it. The 7 values that you say in classical education. What are those?
The 7 classical virtues.
Virtues, sorry.
Yeah, and these have a long history. I think maybe originated or were first stated in the Catholic Church. It might have been Aquinas who synthesized them first. Prudence, fortitude, justice. Now I'm going to embarrass myself. I got 3. There's faith, hope, and charity are the 3 theological virtues. And I just named 6. So I said prudence, justice. I'm embarrassing myself.
It's okay. Don't worry about it.
But they have a long history in the educational arena and in theology. And they're sort of distilled into what are the sort of the characteristics of a virtuous life. And the 4 are the earthly virtues, and then the 3 are the heavenly virtues.
Got it. Yeah, it's so interesting. And I can't, maybe to bring this more to an individual level with yourself, I can't express this enough and sincerely enough when I say it, but to have gone from the career path that you were on prior as a lawyer, a practicing attorney here in town, to deciding one day that you're going to start a school, I just can't even imagine the journey that has been. And I again can't say enough how honorable that I think that is to take on the mission. Listen, anybody can sit back in their chair and complain about the state of affairs, whether it's education or it's political, whatever it is. It's a whole other ballgame to be out in the world doing something about it. And that's why I was really excited to have this conversation with you, is because it wasn't just to illuminate what's frankly a terrifying, sight with real data and facts about where our next generation is both currently and is also heading. And it's an entire other ballgame to be actually out and doing something about it.
Well, you're very kind. I would also tell you that there are a lot of people doing this. And there are small pockets of people in communities all across the country who are founding classical schools and doing the heavy lifting. And it's also the case that I certainly did not do this alone. We have a tremendous board of directors, and I say that not just because they're my boss, but because the people who make up the board is the single most important thing to the success of a school. It's not an easy thing to found a school, and you have to have the people of the right constitution and sort of steady drivers of the ship. And so a lot of this has been a process of a great deal of reward for me as much as sacrifice. The other is I always think of C.S. Lewis and his description, I think it's in the preface to Paradise Lost that he wrote, and he said, vocation is the confluence of duty and desire. And when I look at sort of how I arrived at this place, it sort of started as a sense of duty as a father, and sort of seeing, how are my children going to be educated, and then realizing, what classical education had to offer, and that it had been sort of abandoned in the educational apparatus for a while, that it's not something that I feel particularly comfortable being lauded for, because I had a great desire to do something about it, succeed or fail, right? One of the great challenges for me, but it has been a good challenge for me in the course of this, has been to accept the accept the fact that the success or failure in any measure, whether it's the whole institution of the school or how well we do or any of that, is not all on me, and it is certainly not all attributable to me. And to recognize that all you can do, and I'm a man of deep faith, and I prayed a long time and talked to a lot of family members about whether this was a change that I ought to make. And so I have the sort of liberating sort of sense that I'm doing what I'm called to do, and that's enough. And all I can do is do my very best. And right now we've been blessed with a great deal of success, and I hope it'll continue. But I also believe very strongly in the providential hand of God, and you can't complain, success or failure. You take what he gives you.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Real quick before we wrap, because I think it's an important thing to hit on, and I realize you guys are only 1 year in, as a school. But can you talk even anecdotally a little bit about some of the results you've seen with your students in this setting versus maybe where they were previously? Because obviously, I assume in most cases these kids have come from another school before joining Columbus Classical Academy. So maybe talk just a little bit about some of the results that you've seen.
We have a nice sort of smattering of folks who have come from homeschooling, whether individually or in co-ops, public schools, some private schools, and then some faith-based schools. So there's a nice mix. I'll start by just describing what I've observed in my own children, which has been the thing that I get to see the most, and that is when I drive them home from school. My older daughter, who is a rising sixth grader, when I would pick her up from the public school in the district where we live, and I would ask, "What did you learn today?" And she would just say, "I don't know." And it wasn't that she was miserable. She just, I don't want to talk about it, whatever. She has a younger sister who is a rising second grader now, and they're both at Columbus Classical Academy. And I get into the car now, and there's a little bit of a fight over who gets to share first what they learned. George King, who is one of the executives, he used to be a Major League Baseball executive. He's one of the executives at Hillsdale now in the K-12 office. He had a similar experience with his daughter, who was a third grader, when he went to one of the Hillsdale schools in Leander, Texas. He said it took about 2 weeks, and dinner table conversation was different. and she was talking about, with excitement, what she had learned that day. My daughters, the other kids that I see, the anecdotes that I get from parents, one of them was the young boy I mentioned who had, he's behaviorally a little bit challenging, and they were grateful for the discipline. They were putting him to bed one night, and he just out of nowhere started reciting a Robert Louis Stevenson poem, because it was what he was working on for his recitation. But he was saying it with joy and excitement that he knew this thing. So I'd say the biggest change that I observe, particularly among the younger children, is that there's just a genuine excitement about knowing things. And that may sound silly, and I don't mean to be overly critical of other schools, but because we have such a high emphasis on knowledge, and that we're sharing at very early ages the history and the stories of different epics, different countries, they're learning about the science of mummification, things like that. They're just eager to share what they know in a way that I didn't see in prior schools that they'd been in. And then the other is just behaviorally. They will often sort of cite the virtues or sort of check their behavior because it is something that they there's a felt self-restraint that comes as a result of having gone through a day where there are behavioral expectations that are enforced and are also complied with by their peers. And so I see and hear from parents about how there's just a little bit more sort of discipline and focus in their child. Obviously, as you said, it's been a year, right? And I don't promise magic for any parent who sends their kid. It's a long process. It takes time. All of these habits are habits that get built year over year over year. But you do see results pretty quickly in some measure.
Well, and maybe it's just a closing point to that. There was a quote in the presentation that I saw that you were in about, and I can't paraphrase it directly, so I'll ask that you do. It's a quote around the education of today informing the government of tomorrow.
The Lincoln quote.
Yes.
Abraham Lincoln, that the philosophy in the schoolroom today will be the philosophy of government tomorrow.
Whew. I mean, if that isn't a reason to take this topic more serious than any, I don't know what is. And so that really landed with me. I want to ask you this question because, frankly, it's the theme of the podcast in general, and we've asked it in every one. And I didn't know, because this is very much a different conversation than we've had before on the pod, I didn't know whether or not it fit. But as we've sat together, and again, as I commend you for the journey that you've been on individually, which we didn't get into enough, but we'll save it for another time. When I say the words, "I can fly" to you, what does that mean? How does that land for you? And is there, or has there been, a time in your life where you felt that before?
Well, my first reaction is that as a former runner, when I felt great in a race, I felt I could fly. But on a much more sort of personal and serious level, the moments where that sort of sensibility has sort of overtaken me are the moments where I felt closest to God. And that faith in Jesus Christ and walking where He leads instead of where I want to go tend to be those moments where even when they're the hardest, when sometimes I'm on my knees praying and asking for clarity or guidance or help, that it's not on my own strength, and it's recognition of how sort of weak and pathetic I actually am, that those are the times when I even think of the verse in Isaiah, they will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. And so as long as I maintain that posture toward God and sort of work in humility, then I'll have a shot at flying. And the moment I try to do it myself, I'll come crashing down.
I love that. It's so true. And it's even an interesting thing too, before we wrap, to have such a personal vocation, yet from the school's perspective, not being directly religiously affiliated, to how I understand.
Yeah.
There's obviously Christian value in it, but I'm sure there is in a multitude of religions and what is dictated as a religion. I'm sure there's kind of a multitude of wisdoms that are taught in those.
Yeah, and so our school has a board requirement that the membership affirm the Apostles' Creed. So we are fundamentally a Christian-governed school, and we have board policies that require that we lead and govern and administer the school in a manner consistent with historic Orthodox Christianity. But we make the pledge to families not only that they don't have to sign a statement of faith to attend, but that we don't view it as our responsibility or role to catechize or evangelize their children. We view ourselves as a civic institution. Because of the philosophies that I talked about, we don't think you can be neutral about sort of the foundational questions of life and about what it is to be a human being and what the narrative of history is and all that. But as an educational institution, we also very much respect the parents as the first educators. And we also want to build a community of people who recognize what an excellent education is, regardless of what background they happen to come from. Certainly my hope as a born-again Christian is that every individual will come to faith in Christ. But it is also not the role of every institution in society to primarily be seeking to produce pious Christians as its primary objective. I actually believe strongly that when people see and recognize what a good education is, founded in goodness, truth, and beauty, that in some ways that's laying a foundation for them so that whatever time in their life it comes, when they have to answer the biggest questions, they'll have the knowledge and the character and the desire to know the truth to pursue it sort of vigilantly.
That's beautiful. Very cool. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Dan. This has been a fascinating and for me, extremely mind-opening conversation, and one that I'm sure will draw a lot of questions for folks. And if folks want to learn a little bit more about specifically what you're doing, how can they learn more?
Yeah, they can go to the website. We're actually having our website rebuilt, but we've got one at columbusclassical.org.
Got it.
And it should have any information. And they can contact me if they're even curious about anything in particular. We love to have visitors. We're open doors, and people can visit classrooms during the school year and kind of see how it's going. But I can't thank you enough for having me. It's been a real privilege, and like I said, just good conversation is sort of the stuff of being human. So
Amen.
I'm grateful for it.
Very cool. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.